Howdy folks, it's me, Josh. The year is 1848, and after a decisive victory, the United States had defeated Mexico in the Mexican-American War. And after the war, the US would end up annexing California and New Mexico from Mexico. But before that, there was actually a push for the United States to annex the entirety of Mexico. So, what if that happened? Before we can get into that, we need to understand a bit about the situation between Mexico and America. Let's start with Mexico. Mexico had first gained independence from Spain in the year 1821 after an 11 years long war for independence. And as soon as Mexico was free, things instantly became extremely chaotic. To show you what I mean, upon its independence, Mexico was under the rule of the First Mexican Empire before a revolt broke out in 1823 when the country was placed under a provisional government before eventually becoming a republic, and Central America also seceded. But while the Republicans were drafting the Constitution, there was a lot of bickering over whether the country should follow a federal model or a central model, with the Federalists ultimately winning out. However, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, a centralist, would end up starting his own revolt, taking over the country and ruling as a dictator, getting rid of the federal model and centering power around himself. Oh, and by the way, to show you just how crazy things were, Santa Anna had served as president of Mexico on 11 separate occasions under 3 different regimes. And also, while all of this was happening, Mexico was also being invaded by Spain, who wanted to retake control, and by France because some Mexican officers wrecked a French dude's pastry shop or something. Meanwhile, Texas had been largely unpopulated until about the 1820s when the Mexican government decided that it would be a great idea to bring in a bunch of American settlers to develop the region. But oops, as it turns out, the settlers were more loyal to their home country than to Mexico, and so when Santa Anna tried to centralize the government, the Texans fought back, ultimately starting the Texan Rebellion. So now, let's shift gears over to the US. Many in the US have been pushing for the ideas of manifest destiny, in that it was America's duty to expand across the continent and spread the American way. And after Texas rebelled from Mexico, advocates of Manifest Destiny began pushing for the annexation of Texas, which the Texan government had also been pushing for as well. And in 1844, Democrat James K. Polk would end up being elected on a staunchly expansionist platform, pushing for the annexation of all of California, Texas, and Oregon. Shortly before he took office, the US would end up annexing Texas, but the thing is, Texas kinda had a major border dispute with Mexico, and by annexing Texas, the US had inherited this dispute. So, in order to take control of the territory, and hopefully force Mexico to cede California and New Mexico as well, Polk would end up sending troops into the disputed territory, which Mexico interpreted as an attack, retaliating, and starting the Mexican-American War. The US would end up wiping the floor with Mexico, conquering all of the disputed territory as well as California and New Mexico, while General Winfield Scott would capture Mexico City. And due to this, the Mexican government would, once again, fall as the Federalists took control again. And fun fact, when Winfield Scott took control of Mexico City, several prominent members of the Mexican government asked him to be their new dictator. He said no. Back in the US, though, the general populace were torn on the war, as most Democrats supported it, while most Whigs were against it, seeing it as an unjust war of territorial expansion. And seeing this divide, the Mexican government believed that they were actually in a much better negotiating position than it seemed, so despite losing their capital, they refused to negotiate. However, this would only piss off many more Americans, as many in the US began advocating for the annexation of all of Mexico in what was known as the All Mexico movement, seeing US annexation as the only way to pacify the region and also to spread Americanism. The movement had actually existed ever since the start of the war, as since Mexico had abolished slavery, many Northern Democrats saw this as an opportunity to curb the spread of slavery. But after the failure of the Wilmot Proviso, which would have banned slavery in all of the territory annexed from Mexico, this initial push died down. But once Mexico refused to surrender, the movement gained fervor once again as many prominent Democrats, such as Vice President George Dallas, Lewis Cass, and James Buchanan, as well as Tammany Hall in New York, had all spoken in favor of annexation. However, the movement also saw widespread backlash both from anti-war advocates as well as those who saw the Catholic Hispanic Mexican population as incompatible with the Protestant white American population. In the end, due to this, President Polk wouldn't push for an annexation of all of Mexico, as he had to defend the wars being to secure peace with Mexico and not an aggressive war of territorial expansion. So, in the ensuing Treaty of Guadalupe-Hidalgo, the US would end up annexing the territories of California and New Mexico, while the Mexican state would live on. But what if that changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, the push for an annexation of all of Mexico had gained more popularity, and President Polk had pursued an annexation despite backlash? After the end of the war, the US ends up forcing the Mexican government to sign an alternate version of the Treaty of Guadalupe-Hidalgo, which sees the annexation of the entirety of Mexico into the United States. Needless to say, this would cause a lot of internal problems within the US. First of all, such an annexation would cause extreme backlash from many Whigs, greatly weakening the Polk presidency for the rest of its term. And then comes the issue of slavery. Since Mexico had already abolished slavery at this point, core Mexico would still keep this policy of abolition in place. But although some Northerners would use this to push for the admission of these areas as states in order to gain an upper hand on the South, many in America probably wouldn't want to allow for this due to their perceived incompatibility. Instead, we'd likely end up seeing large amounts of American migration into Mexico in order to displace the Mexican population. In northern Mexico, which was rather underpopulated due to their close proximity to the American South, the area likely ends up being dominated by Southerners, who largely end up settling along the Rio Grande and the coast, which were best suited for agriculture as the region ends up allowing for slavery. However, further south, in core Mexico, many Mexicans would push back against American migration. In fact, one of the other reasons that many had pushed back against an American annexation of Mexico was that it would cause a surge in nationalism in an already rebellious region. So, as a result, the influx of American migrants into core Mexico would lead to intense backlash from the Mexican population as Mexico breaks out into open revolt with frequent clashes between Mexicans and American settlers. Due to this revolt, the US is likely forced to send in the military in order to crush the revolts, but this would only bolster Mexican nationalism even more. Back in the main US, the issue of slavery would once again boil over as the nation breaks out into civil war. However, due to the strain that the occupation of Mexico would cause on the US military, I could see the US government making a deal with Mexico, agreeing to grant them independence, as well as the return of territories in northern Mexico which had permitted slavery, in exchange for Mexican support against the Confederacy. The Mexicans likely agree as Mexico regains independence, but with American occupation having greatly bolstered Mexican nationalism, Mexico probably ends up under a hardline nationalist dictatorship, pushing for the re-annexation of lost territories and revenge against the American occupiers. And after the war, Mexico is given territory up to the Rio Grande, while the US still holds on to Sonora and Baja California due to their position on the Pacific coast. With Mexico under such a nationalist dictatorship, it's very likely that they would once again try to rein in control of northern Mexico, while the region, much like Texas, having seen large amounts of American migration, breaks out into revolt. However, unlike Texas, with the US under the rule of the radical Republicans who are pursuing harsh policies of Reconstruction against the South, I doubt the Southerners in northern Mexico would be too keen on joining the Union at this point. And meanwhile, the US, fearing that this southern revolt against an abolitionist government might inspire the South to revolt against them, the US would probably aid Mexico in putting down the revolts. But this would not go over well with the South. Southerners in the US would be furious against the US government for this, seeing this as an aggressive act to suppress Southerners who were revolting against a dictatorship. As a result, tensions would likely find themselves rising in the US once again between Northerners and Southerners, as the country seems to be on the brink of another civil war. And as the nationalist government in Mexico retakes control of the north, they very likely begin pushing further, seeking the return of their former territory as revenge against the Americans. So, as time moves on, the North American continent ends up becoming a much more tense region as conflict lies ahead. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, make sure to stick around for more. And hey, you could also maybe subscribe or something. So that's it for today's video. Well, till next time, see ya.